Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. A couple of days ago when I was doing my microbrand video looking at the future of microbrands, one of the things I mentioned was I think it's getting better for consumers but perhaps harder for brands, particularly new entrants. When I was doing the research for that, I made some notes about one of the complicating factors for new brands is that there's something of a retreat from globalization, that there are more countries putting more rules in place to control the flow of goods that complicate the issue for smaller brands, and particularly newer brands that might not have particularly sophisticated supply chains or delivery chains. I didn't chase that down, mainly because it was very much about the mechanics and the economics of the supply side, which I don't really deal with a lot. I've got some information from some of my viewers about this, but it's still not an area that's entirely kind of within my bailiwick, and I didn't feel comfortable going into it. That is discussed a little bit though in a Worn and Wound article and podcast, which I'll link to below, and I'd strongly recommend you go listen to that. It's really interesting. But that idea of what's going on with international relationships and what's going on with trade and what that means in watches was rattling around in my head as I watched a video from Paul Thorpe where he was talking about his view of what's going to happen for the watch industry and the watch trade within the UK in a post-Brexit world. And in there, I would not normally have got involved in that. Brexit is your problem. This is something you chose to do. I'm talking to people from the UK a lot. But this is something the people of the UK chose to do. I'm not going to tell you whether you're right or wrong, but in there, in his video, Paul talks about forging new relationships with countries like mine, like Australia, in a post-Brexit world. And he looks forward quite optimistically to how that could make your lives as watch collectors a lot easier. And I found that didn't feel right to me. As a watch collector, a small watch collector who deals at the lower end, not being part of a large trading bloc, not being part of a big area of shared rules like the EU, has actually made my life immeasurably more difficult. And so listening to Paul's video, I found myself thinking, I can't agree with that, and I felt like I should give a different side of the story and talk about what it's like in Australia now, not being in the US, not being in the EU, and trying to be a watch collector. So the first thing I'd say is I just want to provide a little bit of a backup to that statement I made earlier, that there is a bit of a retreat from globalization going on. Don't get me wrong, it is not like we're going back to this is a phrase I will use a couple of times. We are not going back to the 70s. We are not seeing 30% tariffs being rolled out across the world everywhere. And we are continuing to see globalization in some, and a reduction in rules in some areas, mostly in the virtual world. So digital transactions, digital services are continuing to become freer and freer. So you will, in a post-Brexit world, or in any kind of world, we will continue to see more and more information becoming available. We'll continue to see the rules around our access to information falling away, at least in the West. That is not necessarily true, though, of the trade of real goods. You will see across the board more and more rules being put in place around the movement of these goods, particularly, if you like, almost as a counterbalance to the transfer of information. As governments have found that their people can more and more easily access pricing and supply chains from overseas and thereby avoid potentially their taxes, the government have by and large responded by increasing controls on the flow of physical goods, gating those more carefully and imposing more and more rules around bringing those into your country. And I'll talk about some of the effects of those in Australia as we move forward. But very quickly, if you want to see some sort of real life examples of the pullback on these sorts of global endeavors to make trade easier, it's not hard to find any evidence of it. The first thing I'd say from an Australian point of view, the first thing we noticed was that the US pulled out and wouldn't ratify the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was never going to be as much as rule-free as the EU arrangements, but would certainly have helped and made things easier for us. You also see the US renegotiating their NAFTA agreements, placing many more rules on the flow of goods and services between the US, Canada and Mexico. In Australia, you're seeing more and more limitations being put on foreign investment in our country, and you see a lot of restrictions being put and newer restrictions being put on how what we call GST, what many countries overseas would call VAT, on pretty much every transaction that moves backwards and forwards, and are making, for example, large electronic trading platforms like eBay and Amazon build into their delivery systems GST collection systems for Australian GST for every product you buy through those platforms. And all of those things are happening despite the fact that most goods that we buy here in Australia are in fact duty-free. Tariffs are very unusual for pretty much anything you import into Australia. Watches are duty-free no matter where they come from. Pretty much drugs, alcohol, guns, that sort of stuff, that'll attract a tariff. But in Australia, there's essentially no tariffs. And on top of that, we have free trade agreements with most of our major trading partners. And yet, despite that, I continue to experience a whole bunch of problems dealing with overseas supplies and getting stuff into Australia. Because it's not about the tariffs, it's about the rules, and it's about the rules particularly associated with imports, import controls, labeling, obviously paying local GST or local VAT, and a whole bunch of other things. And let me walk through some examples of things that have happened to me because of those rules. In my watch collecting, I've bought maybe about 24, 25 items from the EU. 3 of those transactions have been disastrous. So that's 1 in 8. And it's mostly because of confusion around the rules involved in bringing stuff into Australia. I've had one where, due to difficulties in filling out the forms required to get it into Australia and to deal with the shipping to get things to Australia, I had a watch that got hung up in customs for about 3 months, during which time the money I was paying to the supplier was locked up in escrow. So he's really angry about this. I'm really frustrated with him. Even though he's trying to do the right thing, I'm getting no help at all from Australian customs. Everything finally worked its way out, but the end result was, and I'll put a screen grab up, I'll put a screenshot up of the conversation I had. They got so angry, the supplier got so angry that they've said they're never shipping to Australia again, and they've stuck to that. I've tried to buy stuff from him again more recently, and he just won't ship it here. I had another case where after a long hunt, I found a watch I absolutely would die for. It's one I was desperately after. I had a seller who I trusted. I was really hot on this watch, and it was $1,500 Australian, so $1,000 US, cheaper than anywhere else I'd been able to find it. And I'll put a screenshot up of the end result of a month's worth of mucking around trying to get that transaction to happen. He pulled out because he couldn't be comfortable finding a shipping provider that he felt he could get to Australia, and ended up selling it at an even cheaper price to a local provider within the EU. The last thing I'd point out, the last transaction was one where, again, in order to get stuff into Australia, you have to fill out a bunch of forms. Sometimes companies don't necessarily mark the items correctly, and then our local customs people have to go through and do some work recalculating what they feel the GST should be on that item. They do their own assessment, and then they sting the buyer with the GST before they'll release it from customs. Not that unusual. In this particular case, because of an error from this, and a relatively small error from the seller in, I think this one was Italy, then it might have been Spain. There was an error in the paperwork that he provided on what I ended up getting stung for. I think it was $230, $240 for GST that I had never intended to pay, that shouldn't have been warranted on me. But he was a private seller, so he's vanished. He doesn't care anymore. If I want my goods, I have to pay it. Otherwise, it's just going to be locked up in a bonded store for all time. So I pay it, and I get it. And then when I'm firing stuff back to him, back to the seller, he doesn't care. Not his problem. My customs, my issue, was what he said. And you know what? He's got a half a point. So that's my experience of what it's like trying to be a small watch collector outside of a large trading bloc like the US or the EU. It's complicated and it's hard, and you've got all these rules and all these barriers between you and the outside world. I've spent I've spent my entire time as a collector of things, envying the way I watch things moving around within the EU. And so to watch the people of the UK choose to come into my world was kind of astounding. You made that choice, that's fine. Your sovereign right, you chose to do so, great. You know, you're exercising your democratic right. But watching Paul Thorpe's video, I got the feeling that there was this expectation that there was some sort of free trade, rule-free Shangri-La on the other side of Brexit, and that there was this, you know, massive goodwill of countries like Australia that was suddenly going to open up and become places that you could buy and sell watches from super freely. And living in one of those countries, I felt that I should let you know that's not going to happen. It's probably going to get hard. And all the problems that I have buying watches from Italy and Spain and Greece and Austria and Germany, who, by the way, I routinely buy from because they're so cheap, they're probably going to become your problems too. And I didn't think it was fair for people in the UK to sort of imagine that that's not what's going to happen. I hope it doesn't. I hope your government is smarter than ours. I hope your government manages to find a way to raise the revenue it genuinely needs without putting in place all the rules that the Australians have. But I wanted to warn you that that's not likely, and our experience hasn't been fantastic. Anyway, I don't really expect anyone from the EU I don't expect anyone from the UK to really like this video, because I don't think I gave you any good news. If I warned you, maybe you should hit the like button. Please subscribe to the channel though. This is what I do. I talk about stuff. I talk about watches. I talk about the watch industry. I talk about my experience as a collector. And I try to look at things with a little bit differently to everyone else. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. If you wait just a little while, a card's going to come up with some contact details on my Instagram. I routinely forget to do wristwatch checks. I won't today. Today I'm wearing my Mueller Glasuta M99 City automatic watch. Love this little thing. The only watch I really wear on a bracelet. I'm generally not a big bracelet fan, but this comes with a sort of weird integrated third link that's very difficult to put anything else on, so I'm stuck with it. Luckily, I quite like it. I'll do a review on that coming up shortly. So anyway, that's it. Leave comments below. As I said, please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you later. Bye.